Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Awkward Conversations, the podcast where we embrace the awkwardness and talk all things neurodivergent, with a variety of interesting and accomplished neurodivergent guests. I'm your host, Samantha Stein, aka Yo Samdy Sam on YouTube. And wherever you're watching or listening from, I hope you get enjoyment and value out of these conversations, awkward or not. My guest today is Steph Jones, an ADHD psychotherapist, neurodevelopmental diagnostician, and author of The Autistic Survival Guide to Therapy, which is out now. I received an advanced copy of this and I absolutely loved it. It's one of the few books where, even among books about autism, where I actually felt completely seen and validated. And if you are interested in this book, I do have a discount code for listeners, so take advantage of that if you would like to order this book. Links are in the description. So Steph actually reached out to me about a year ago, wondering if she could interview me for her book. And the chance to be in a book, which I did not have to write, was really too good to pass up. So naturally, I said yes. And we had such an amazing conversation that I knew that it would make for a fantastic podcast episode. So without further ado, please welcome Steph to the studio. How are you today, Steph?
I'm good, Sam. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. We were just joking before we started recording that our brains are both a little frazzled today. So maybe it'll be an more awkward conversation than usual.
I was going to say the name of the podcast feels very fitting in terms of the awkwardness today. But it's not our fault though, is it?
It's not our fault. And
No.
and the last episode, I said, oh, how awkward was this conversation at the end? And my guest Hazel she was like, oh, it's not awkward at all. I was like, oh, did I name this wrong? But I think as we go on, we will discover that there is quite a lot of awkwardness in both of our brains at the moment. I'm currently temporarily off my ADHD meds, so my brain is all over the place. And this is where we see what a mask I've built up, because everyone will go, oh, you look completely normal. I have to admit, when I introduced you there, I did copy-paste your credentials from the website. But can you tell everybody a little bit about yourself, your professional background in your own words?
So I became a psychotherapist about 10 years ago, really because I've spent my entire life trying to figure myself out and trying to understand, in my mind, what was wrong with me. As many autistic and ADHD people tend to do. We often think that whatever's going on for us, that the roots have to be like this psychological thing that we've got to like somehow work out. And I basically found out that I was autistic 3 years ago. So I'd been a therapist like years and years before I found out. And I didn't find out through the vehicle of being a therapist. I actually found out because an amazing client that I was working with came to session one day and she said, like, I've been working with her for a couple of years, and she was like, do you know what, Steph? She said, I think you're going to think I'm a bit mad for saying this. She said, but I think I'm autistic. And I was like, well, okay, I don't know anything about autism because they don't teach you that on psychotherapy or psychology training courses, which is crazy when you think about it. In fact, one of the stats for the book is a colleague saying that she estimates that about 40% of her client group are undiagnosed neurodivergent people. And I suppose that makes complete sense because often the mental health issues that we're experiencing, it's not because we're autistic, it's not because we've got ADHD. It's almost like this byproduct, if you like, of fitting into this world that isn't geared up with us in mind. And we're really struggling with anxiety or pushing ourselves beyond capacity. So it makes sense that we're going to end up in the therapy room.
I mean, that's just absolutely insane, though. 40% of their clients and therapists are not taught about it. I mean, I suppose it does vary depending on the type of therapy you do, but even I think within psychology, when I did my psychology degree, autism was mentioned, sort of little note in developmental disorders or something like that. But it's just absolutely insane to me that there's a whole field that is almost not acknowledging the existence of their actual clients, or sort of not acknowledging who they are really, and saying, well, actually, this is something that's wrong with you. This is something that's wrong with you.
And it's shocking, I think, because what ends up happening is that, you know, we're sat in a therapy room, typically with a neurotypical therapist, whose brain literally just doesn't work the same, you know, as ours. You know, that we have a completely different perception and a completely different way of thinking, feeling, and just experiencing in general. And quite often we're viewed as our natural behaviours, if you like, often get attributed to trauma or a personality disorder. We might get misdiagnosed, medicated, you know, in some cases even like sectioned, and really going through some awful experiences, just because the clinician doesn't understand actually what's sat in front of them, and it's heartbreaking.
So what was it that kind of inspired you to write the book? What was it that was the turning point for you saying, oh, I just need to write a book about all of this now?
Rage.
Yeah.
Rage. Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's two books in one, really. So the first is it's like a fictional story. It's my journey through therapy. The therapist I talk about isn't a real person, but it's a composite of people I've met, people I've worked with, what I've heard, and it basically talks about my awful experience and how invalidated I've been, how just lost in translation I think you can feel, and I think after, you know, 9 years, I think I 20 odd years of therapy, 9 different therapists, spending thousands and thousands of pounds, becoming a therapist myself and getting absolutely nowhere with it all. It's just, my experience is just not unique here. There's so many autistic people that didn't get the memo, and I just felt like it needed to be written. I needed to just speak on behalf of, you know, neurodivergent people and just say this shouldn't be happening. It's, you know, we shouldn't have to be knocking on doors so hard to get the help that we need. And I did a shout out on Instagram, and I literally had hundreds of people message saying, I've had this awful experience in therapy. It hasn't helped me. It's been a waste of time. If anything, I've been traumatized because I've been in this therapy situation and just felt like humiliated, shamed, and so that was why I wrote it.
I think there's two kind of situations. There's the undiagnosed autistic people in therapy, which I believe is where a lot of this damage is done, when you're undiagnosed and you're trying to do these exercises and you're thinking, what is going on? And then there's the diagnosed autistic people who seek therapy. I think there's kind of two different things to be talking about there. And I was, in preparation for this, I was writing down some of my memories about therapy before my diagnosis, and sort of like afterwards they've been much more focused in certain areas with certain techniques. But when I think about some of the things I did in therapy before my diagnosis, the first, she wasn't a therapist, she was a clinical psychologist. She was the first one I saw after I had a head injury. I had PTSD. I don't think talking therapy was appropriate at that time, but it's what I had. And she got me doing this exercise, which I still think, what was she trying to do? I think she was trying to help me let my anger out or something, but it was about visualizing extremely violent acts towards people I was angry with until they died. And then looking in their eyes and then being like, what do you feel now? And I'm like, I mean, how many years ago was this? Almost 20 years. And I'm like, what was the purpose of that? So what are some of the kind of things that either just don't work or maybe are damaging for autistic people when it comes to therapy? And we're kind of talking more about like undiagnosed autistic people. What are the things that are kind of given as, I guess, standard in therapy that are not going to work well or at all maybe for us?
Yeah, so there's a chapter in the book about this where I I've kind of looked at all of the different well-known approaches, so things like CBT, psychodynamic, all of those kinds of things, which are typically like the gold standard of therapies that we offer. But then I've dug down into the research and actually looked at some of the psychological underpinnings, the theories, if you like, the concepts, to see how they translate to neurodivergent people. And quite often they just don't. You know, things like, for example, something like graded exposure, which is a classic one, which is somebody perhaps is experiencing like social anxiety or something like that. You would work with a therapist to kind of keep socialising in order to kind of like reduce your anxiety. In an autistic person, that isn't going to work at all. We're literally, you know, no amount of graded exposure is going to reduce our physical sensations. You know, sitting in a bright room is not going to help us deal with sensory issues. Similarly, it's not going to allow us to experience the challenges, to basically move past the challenges that we experience socially. We might be better with something that's more like coaching or a skill development for that. But there's other things as well. Obviously, you know, many autistic people have alexithymia and struggle to identify and express what those, you know, what our feelings are. And that's okay, you know, but we're living in this kind of this psychotherapy paradigm where we say we've got to feel the feelings, and it's like, well, actually, if we have a completely different way of processing experience, it might not be about feeling the feelings. It might be about analysis. It might be about being logical, and that's okay because that's how our brains work. But unfortunately, that gets really pathologized as kind of like intellectualizing your feelings, like you're doing therapy wrong. And again, it's just like, well, actually, that's just how we might work. So there's lots of things. Body language, that's another one that just doesn't translate. You know, I've had therapists in the past where I haven't realised that I'm stimming because I'm just like, you know, that's what's going on for me. It's making me feel comfortable. But they're saying, oh, you're very anxious right now. And then you say, no, I'm not feeling anxious. Oh, you are. And then you being defensive about it, they think that's a big issue. So then they make it an issue, and it's like...
Do you know what? Something really similar happened to me. I'd written this down in my notes. One of my therapists said to me that, you seem very uncertain because you always say, I guess, a lot. Like, I guess this is the reason. And I said, no, that's because I watch a lot of American TV, and it's like, it's a vernacular that I've picked up. And so I spent some time trying to convince her that the reason I say I guess is not because I'm literally expressing uncertainty, but because that was just how I say I feel or I think. But that was very much like, you're not in touch with yourself, right? And I was like, no, I literally am. I'm literally telling you, being very, very straightforward. And it was always the kind of implication that, oh no, you're somehow sort of lying to me, or you haven't quite accessed the deeper meaning behind this, right? And that's very invalidating, isn't it?
For me, that's the biggest part of why I don't want to be sat here and make it look like I'm anti-therapy, because I'm not. You know, I am a therapist, and I think the right therapy and the right therapist for neurodivergent people is amazing, you know. But the way that we experience the world, some people talk about it as like the bottom up versus top down, if you know what I mean when I say that. So for neurodivergent people to understand the bigger picture, we need to understand how all the tiny details kind of fit together, and then we get it. But a neurotypical person typically has that top down, so their brains have already filtered out what they think is important, and then they drill down to like the essence of it. And essentially that's what you're doing in your therapy. the therapist is trying to help you get to like the crumbs and to really try and understand that detail. But our brains are already working like that. So quite often we end up being in therapy. We might have therapists say, oh, you're very self-aware.
Yes, I had that a lot.
Yeah, exactly. But the reality is that we're going to therapy because we're overwhelmed. There's just too much information and we're trying to simplify and make sense of something. Whereas traditional therapy does it completely the opposite way, which can actually lead us to like ruminations, feeling stuck on that kind of loop of just getting nowhere and not feeling any better. So that's something to think about as well.
Absolutely, and I think for me, I don't want to dismiss CBT entirely because I think there are so many different ways of doing it, but I definitely had a very unhelpful course of CBT, which was, I mean, it was so broken down into bare bones that I was literally doing a worksheet with a table on it, you know, about like saying, what is the thought that you're thinking and what is a better thought to think, and let's try and force that better thought. The implication being like, you're thinking wrong thoughts, stop it, you know? And I mean, yeah, sure, I gave it a really good shot. I think that contributed to really quite a lot of mental health problems in my 20s because that's what I was trying to do anyway. I was aware there was something wrong and I was trying to not be wrong. And the problem with, well, I suppose CBT is a sort of behavioral kind of approach, is that the problem is not the behavior, the problem is the experience.
Totally agree with you. I feel it's got applications, but I think the underlying thing for CBT is that we are trying to identify and eradicate cognitive distortions. But when you actually look at some of these cognitive distortions for a neurotypical person, such as binary thinking, actually that's just how we think. So we end up trying to, if the premise of CBT is thoughts informs feelings, informs behaviours, and if we intersect one of those things, the loop will improve somehow. But we can't change the way we feel as autistic people. If we're stressed, if something is distressing to us, we can't just change the way, you know, I can't sit in a room full of people and not feel stressed about it.
Well, it goes back to what you were saying about the exposure therapy, you know, because the logic behind that from a neurotypical point of view is that being in a social situation is safe, and therefore your fear of that is irrational. Whereas from an autistic point of view, your fear of that is rational, and so all you're trying to do, all a therapy like that would do is to convince yourself that you cannot be the best judge of your own internal experience, you know, and that's so damaging. When I say it like that, I'm just like, this is really messed up, isn't it? So you've got a whole chapter on trauma, which I love, by the way. I mean, you know, who doesn't love a good bit of trauma? Why is this so relevant to autistic people? That was a nice little segue in. I mean, I obviously think there's a traumatic element to bad therapy and badly handled therapy. Can it go as far as to be developing, you know, trauma from that?
100%, yeah. I think the big thing that, you know, we need to think about is that, you know, as neurodivergent people, we are biologically, I've gone into some of the stats in my book, but we are more biologically at risk for trauma just due to having a different sensory experience of the world. And it makes things all that more difficult because what we experience as traumatic for us might not be what other people experience as being traumatic. I've ended up working with so many neurodivergent people who have been massively traumatised in therapy, and they've actually had to go to therapy to deal with the past therapist. One of the things I talk about in my book, and this is a real example, was after years of therapy not working for me, I got matched with an amazing therapist, And he was so supportive in just validating my experiences. And I actually discovered I was autistic whilst in that therapy. And rather than him make me feel like I was losing it when I broached the topic, he was just like, oh yeah, that would make so much sense. He said, because, you know, I do see a lot of women, particularly your age, that have been, you know, diagnosed with complex PTSD or BPD or bipolar. And actually, it's been autism the whole time. But, you know, the other thing we need to think about as well is that as neurodivergent people, we do have a higher biological risk for trauma, just to do with like neurological differences in the brain, a different sized amygdala. So we're really we're experiencing the world, if you like it, you know, really turned up to 11. So what's traumatic for a neurotypical person might not be traumatic for us, and vice versa. And you know,
and then that leads to further invalidation, right? Because then people say, why are you being so sensitive? It's not such a big deal.
Yeah.
And then that's doubly traumatic because you're not believed.
Yeah.
And you're not supported.
100%. And you know, I mentioned in the book that like when my mum died, I was so, you know, I was upset, but my way of dealing with that was to kind of like learn lots about it and essentially turn it into like a special interest and logically process it. But at that time in my life, I was also living on a friend's sofa. I had no job and I had a job interview on the Monday. So I was like, right, that was my plan. I need to do these things. And yet everybody around me was saying, Steph's really traumatised, it'll hit her later and all that kind of stuff. And I just found it so annoying that people were suggesting that they knew my feelings better than I knew myself, because it was nonsense. But then there's things in my life that's happened where I felt really traumatised, and to the next person it's probably not a big deal at all. And I think that's a big one for me in therapy, because who gets to decide what's traumatic for us?
Well, that's the thing, and also kind of like talking this discussion of trauma, you know, big T trauma versus little t trauma, I think is maybe not even helpful for autistic people who haven't, like you said, you know, we're biologically wired to be more traumatized, and you know, we have I certainly have a jumpy little nervous system, you know, that gets very easily activated, and it doesn't matter whether that activation is, you know, someone jumping out of the shadows or my scarf flapping around and making it seem like there's something there, you know, like my nervous system is gonna jump in the same way. There was a little snippet of your book that I read, and I was like, oh, that's so interesting. Talking about stress management, and I think the metaphor that you used was sort of like someone with a badly functioning liver who's unable to metabolize alcohol in the same way, and the idea was that, you know, we are less able to metabolize stress through our nervous system. Is that sort of backed up with science? I sort of read it and I thought, I've got to ask her about that.
Yeah. So neurodivergent people, not only have we kind of got this elevated level of stress because we're experiencing stress at that kind of higher level, but it actually takes much longer, if at all, to kind of come down to any kind of like baseline. So if you think about it in terms of emotional regulation. I'm drawing a circle here because this is what it would look like. But if you can,
mine doesn't look like that.
If you can imagine it, there was a line going through the centre of the circle, and for the average neurotypical person, they might get a bit excited in the day, but then they'll self-regulate and it'll kind of come down again. Or something bad might happen, but they'll phone a friend or make a cup of tea. So they're kind of like going this nice, easy zigzag throughout the day, and that's emotional regulation. But when we think about the hallmark characteristics of autism and ADHD, we're talking about emotional dysregulation and that inability to be able to rebalance, and also to even be aware that actually our stress has been going up and up and up and up in the day. So what that looks like is actually meltdowns coming out of thin air, but they haven't come out of thin air 9 times out of 10. It's been actually, I was on the train this morning and it was late and it was people barging into me, and actually, my drink was cold, and all of these things build up to such a point where it just kind of explodes. So we don't have that biological and neurological capability to like regulate.
And then we're kind of told to, just practice emotional regulation. And it's like, there are emotional regulation skills. And I sort of agree that we should all be learning them.
Yeah.
But it's also, there's got to be a lot of acceptance of like, actually, this is just the way my brain is, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't fundamentally change that.
Totally. And some of the typical things such as try yoga, try meditation, try deep breathing. Actually, that might make us feel 10 times worse. If we're overwhelmed and overthinking and we actually tune into our bodies and we start doing deep breathing, it might amplify that. And one of the best things I think we can do is to find distractions, to completely get ourselves out of that mindset and put some music on, do some singing, do something that actually just takes you out of that frame of reference. I think distraction is a massive one to kind of bring us back in the room again. But
yeah, and I when I read that bit about kind of getting into emotional rumination, or what is it called? Where you get to that point, I certainly get in that point where I'm sitting, on the sofa in the evening and I'm just going round and round and round. And it's usually as a result of a conflict that I've had, with friends or family or something like that. And I'm sitting there, I literally can't break out of it. To other people, I imagine it looks like I'm giving them the silent treatment or something, but the silent treatment, I think that is one of the biggest problems that autistic people have with regards to communication, is that what something looks like and how it is experienced are so different, and our intentions are often given malicious intent when there is none. And that's really hard to come to terms with when you're sitting there on the sofa spiraling inside but just being completely silent, and someone else thinking, oh well, she didn't want to talk to me, kind of thing. We know that therapy can be hit or miss for a lot of autistic people, a lot of times miss. We know that autistic people are more susceptible to trauma and can be traumatized by the very therapies that are supposed to be helping them. So let's try and take some positive action now. What does work for autistic people in terms of therapy?
So again, to kind of reiterate what I was saying before, this isn't about demonizing therapy, because we're all unique, and actually what I might want out of therapy might not be what you want out of therapy. But I think it may help us to seek out another neurodivergent therapist, somebody who automatically understands what our world is like. That's not to say that there aren't amazing neurotypical therapists who really pour their lives into understanding us, and but I would really advise people to do the homework in terms of what is it they're trying to get. Essentially, what is it you're trying to fix or cure? Because if you're trying to cure neurodiversity, that's not going to work. And I've met so many people who've come to therapy with me that are essentially saying, how do I mask better? How do I be more neurotypical? How do I avoid burnout when their experience is naturally burning them out, as if they're trying to hack being autistic in some way. So I'd possibly consider looking into finding neurodivergent therapists. But also some of the creative type therapies as well. Tony Atwood, who contributed to the book, he talks very much about he might work with a client and say, rather than you tell me how you feel about this, go away and research 20 of your favourite pieces of music and bring it back to next session, or grab 10 pictures that are conveying exactly how you feel. So alternative ways to describing what's within, I think creative therapies can be brilliant. Something like EMDR, which is massively helpful in terms of working with trauma. So that could be an option as well. Also, it is, depending on what country you're in, psychedelic therapies as well. Unfortunately, in the UK, it's not legal at this point.
Well, I'm fortunate to live in the Netherlands, so maybe
I
we'll
know.
be hearing about that at a future point. Yeah, there's been some really interesting studies, because I believe it's been decriminalized for research in the States now. I think there's quite a lot of research coming out of the States on psychedelic therapy. And I think that's got, such a potential for neurodivergent people who are already so creative in many ways.
100%, yeah. I think it's I'm choosing my words carefully here, but it's something that I feel very strongly about, in terms of it actually being a potential tool to understanding, yourself and the world around you in ways that I don't think psychotherapy can even touch.
Yeah, because we always assume that therapy equals basically talk therapy, is that talking will be the solution to everything. And I think it was, what's the book called? The Body Keeps the Score. You mentioned that, I think, where they look at the brain basically being triggered, having a traumatic flashback, and the area of the brain that... sorry, now my words are failing me. Is my trauma being activated right now? Not sure. They look at, they put the traumatized people in a scanner, which was not the original trauma. They activated their trauma, and they saw that the area of the brain responsible for language was deactivated when the trauma was activated, meaning that you literally can't access the part of your brain that involves language when you are triggered.
Yeah. 100%.
And that was a really whoa moment for me, because it's like, if you're traumatized, talking about it is,
it's not gonna,
it's got to be done another way, right?
Yeah.
And so this is why I'm very interested in I don't want to call them alternative therapies, because that gives the wrong, but non-talking therapeutic sort of interventions. I have personal experience with EMDR. I did do a video on that a few years ago, and I also recently did something called heart coherence therapy, which when she said that this is going to be about breathing, I almost left the room when she said it was breathing exercise. I kept at it, and the results, when it did finally work after about a week and a half, were as significant as EMDR for me. It was like a switch to my nervous system. So I think the more experience I have of these things, the more sort of open-minded I am, and I think the nervous system regulation stuff is going to be so relevant for the neurodivergent population who've got, I don't want to say wonky nervous systems, but what sort of nervous systems do we have? Are they just sensitive?
Just sensitive.
Or how would you describe them?
Yeah, just sensitive. And I think, that sometimes that word gets thrown around as a negative thing, and it's not. It's it's the reason that we're often musicians and artists and and therapists and actors, because we've got that real capacity to feel.
There was an amazing song by Jewel. Do you remember that one in the 90s?
Which one?
It goes, "I'm sensitive and I'd like to stay that way."
Yeah, exactly.
It's a lovely song.
Yeah, and it's I think it's something that we should be really proud of. Whereas in traditional therapy, we might not necessarily be praised for being sensitive. We might even be encouraged to kind of grow a thicker skin and become more tolerant of things that are just really stressful for us. But the point you're making about talk therapy is not necessarily being that effective. If you've got a communication based difference, we were talking at the start of the show about how this might be awkward. I've just been diagnosed with ADHD, so I'm going through titration right now. I'm quite happy to share that.
We're not too awkward, I don't think, at the moment.
No,
but out of 1 to 10, I still think we're at about a 2 or 3.
You're off them, I'm on them, but it's like,
yeah.
so but I suppose But that way of us, so you know, say for example, I was in a therapy situation right now, scrabbling around in my own brain to try and find out, well, what's the relevant parts that I need to communicate to my therapist. And quite often we tend, when neurodivergent people are talking, as you well know, Sam, one of us takes the floor, shares it all out, then the next person does it, and it's that kind of depth, kind of back and forth. Whereas talk therapy is often much like the neurotypical game of conversational ping pong, going backwards and forwards, and we just might not be able to process it that quick. You know, quite often, you know, I've been in therapy and asked a question that I don't even know what the answer is to that question until 2 weeks down the line. So I think unless we've got the right person that understands how our brain works, we're really going to get into significant challenges, really.
Yeah, yeah. And I have to say that, you know, I'm just trying to think now about timelines. You know, I was in and out of therapy throughout my 20s and early 30s. It was only at the point afterwards where, you know, I had the diagnosis, so I knew what was wrong with me. I knew what the situation was. And that was the point where I had a round of ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy. And that was very helpful because I guess it was the first time that a therapy had allowed me, or the intention was to be kind to yourself, right? You know, because so often it's a very almost critical process, and we don't need another person criticizing us, like, in our head. And I know that some people find DBT helpful. I don't have personal experience of that, but honestly, it's only with my current therapist, who is not a psychologist. She's a neurodiversity affirming therapist. I think she calls herself something like that. She's neurodivergent but not autistic. It was only at that point, which is really in the last, I don't know, year and a half, where I feel I've made more progress during this time. And what we've been working on has really just been, I don't know, I suppose it's been radical acceptance of neurodiversity, of your own neurodivergence. And when you think of therapy, it definitely implies that there's something to be fixed or something to be worked on, rather than just a kind of more gentle process of sort of gently unraveling what's going on and seeing yourself with that clear lens, you know?
Yeah, 100%. I think it, you know, like in hindsight now, one of the big things that I've always tried to figure out in therapy, and it's taken me down so many routes of almost wondering if there's kind of like some kind of like multiple personality issues going on. Because I used to go to therapy and say, I feel like there's two of me. I feel like there's this really kind of like rule-based person that everything's got to be perfect, and really, you know, just like, you know, God, that's not straight, that's, you know, I've got to do that and everything. And I said, then there's this other part of me that just wants fun and like wants to be spontaneous and silly and have parties and, you know, be very sociable. And spending years and years in therapy trying to like balance these two personalities, and figure out where they come from, and you know, is this to do with your mother? Is it your father? Blah blah blah. And in hindsight, I'm now going, hang on a minute, I've just literally age 44, I've just found out I've got ADHD. That's that personality, and the other one is the autism. What I've been trying to balance is neurodiversity. And actually, I'm just like, I've spent so much money and time trying to figure this out. It's
so funny though, because I didn't realise that you didn't know when we talked. Like, we talked a year ago. Like, if you hadn't realised, I would have told you. But I get in trouble for that sort of thing.
Can I just say, like, literally, I didn't know, and I started work, and I worked with these amazing neurodivergent clinicians, and we did some ADHD training, and I was like, I don't think I am. And everybody just erupted in laughter. And it was almost like everybody else knew, but I didn't.
But it's interesting though. I was talking to a journalist earlier today about this sort of ADHD combination and how it ends up masking, each one masks the other one in some ways. Because I don't have an official diagnosis of ADHD because I don't need one in this country to access ADHD meds. It's an approved. I don't know what to call it. I didn't know what to call it on the phone call either. It's approved to use ADHD meds for autistic traits, right?
Oh.
So I didn't see the point in getting one because I thought it was pretty obvious, and so did my audience, which was how I sort of came to realize it. I've completely lost my train of thought now. Where was I going with this? I was
talking about ADHD.
About ADHD.
Oh, the irony.
Masking each other. The audience are sitting there listening to us screaming. It was this. Oh my goodness. We're struggling a little bit today, folks.
The masking, and I suppose that trying to find that balance, and trying to, talking about balancing personalities and the difference between kind of ADHD and autism. For me, that's a totally fascinating area just in terms of neurology as it is, because one part has like a longer signalling communicator in the brain and the other part has a shorter signalling. So you think, I actually think in years to come, we will talk about people with ADHD and autism. I think it'll be like almost like a third animal.
I think so. I think that there is a substantial difference in the experience of an autistic person versus an ADHDer versus an ADHDer. And this is part of the reason why, when I started making content about autism online, I was trying to be very careful. I was trying to be very much, not just saying, oh, this is my experience, this is what autism is like, but saying, okay, this is how I experienced it, but autism is sort of, is this. And then I was just wondering, like, why I didn't feel like I fit in with other autistic people, like just autistic people. And then the more I started meeting other people, they go, well, I'm an ADHD. And I go, oh, well, I guess that's why we're friends. It becomes, I think there's definitely a kind of case of people being drawn to each other who have very similar predispositions. Sorry, I really shouldn't be apologizing for this, should I? I shouldn't be apologizing for the natural thing that my brain is naturally doing, the way that it has grown in my head. But old habits. Talk to me about this long and short stuff that you just said. I can't even remember what words you said. One side is long distance and one side is short distance.
It's just about actual kind of the connectors in the brain in terms of like signalling. And that in autistic people, I can never remember which way round it goes, but in autistic people, those are shorter signalling pathways, and I think it's ADHD, are longer signalling pathways. So then you think about the person that's got both of those, and actually how that affects in terms of the way we think. So we don't necessarily... it can be really difficult for us to kind of get a positive diagnosis of either autism or ADHD because actually we might not fill enough diagnostic criteria for both. So quite often we're really, really struggling because they are almost kind of cancelling each other out. But that doesn't mean we're not struggling, it just means that we're internalising everything. Which is why I can also see the massive benefit in psychedelic therapy that you were talking about, because what that does is it takes us off the kind of default mode network in the brain, and all of a sudden the brain starts communicating globally. So I think it's got huge advantages.
That's so interesting. I know that there's I don't know too much about the impact on the brain, but I know that psychedelics they increase the plasticity of the brain, which means sort of in layman's terms that it's easy to create new habits, new thought patterns afterwards, which is why it's been especially effective in treating addiction, which obviously is something that autistic and ADHD people are also predisposed to. We get all the good stuff, don't we? What would your take-home advice be for autistic people or neurodivergent people who are struggling with therapy in one way or another? What's the kind of process or starting point that you would advise them?
I think so. In the book, I've kind of put together a roadmap, if you like, of so that we can recognise when it's not working in a session. Because quite honestly, sometimes it's difficult for us to figure out what we're struggling with in therapy, whether it's actually the topic of what we're trying to work through, or if it's just the relationship with the therapist. So in the book, there's a number of things to think about in terms of adaptations that we could ask for, making sure that our therapist has the right credentials, and to interview them. You know, when we first make that initial inquiry, find out what is it they know about autism. Like, did they do a one-day seminar, or do they have children who are autistic? So that we can actually start to understand how they're perceiving it. Because quite honestly, if all they've ever looked at is the kind of clinical perspective of autism, it's very likely that they're going to bring stuff with that, such as viewing it as a disorder, you know, a disability, rather than something to be worked with. But also, I think the other big one, and I suppose you've touched on it, Sam, is around that kind of just self-validation and making sure that how we want to live our lives is not frowned upon by the therapist. You know, I've worked with people where they've been diagnosed, and then they have decided that they want to leave their partners, they want to leave their job, they want to really start diving into that authenticity that's been suppressed over the years. But I've known of lots of horror stories where therapists have been like, oh, I think you're being rash, and you know, this is a midlife crisis, you know.
Well, I think it's also there's a lot of narrative about unmasking, and that can be something that I think for some people it's beneficial to work through with a therapist after diagnosis. But you need to think sort of like on a more zoomed out level. Like, do you actually need or want to unmask? Because there may be aspects of masking that are keeping you safe or employed, or all of these things. And I see some content creators online talking about being or unmasking to get to your authentic self, and I think masking is so much more complicated than that. And when you're late diagnosed, you don't just rip it off and then find yourself underneath, right?
You can.
Like, it is you and you are it.
Yeah.
And then it's a question of saying, okay, well, which bits do I need and which bits don't I need? Which bits of me are absolutely fine. Yeah. I just needed a name for it.
I think it can be very sophisticated, actually, and I completely agree with you. Sometimes I see stuff on social media of, people almost demanding that if you're neurodivergent, it must look like this, and you must take off the mask. And the way I experience it really is, it's like I almost see it as like learning a different language. I'm not going to rock up in the middle of Tokyo and demand that everybody speak English, but the other way around, I wouldn't be able to speak a second language 24/7. So I suppose it's about finding what works for us, where it's that sweet spot of actually, this is who I am. I'm not compromising my integrity, who I am completely. But that has to be on our terms. All of this stuff has to be on our terms, I think, and there's not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to human beings, let alone neurodivergent people with different things to work out.
Yeah, and I think it's just really important, especially in the context of giving autistic people more agency over their lives. We, autistic people, are disproportionately institutionalized as well. I think there was a statistic in your book that, there's the percentage of people in institutions is extremely high. I think over 50% or something like that. And you know, even if you are living sort of independently, there's still this sense of that you don't really know what's best for you, and you can't be trusted to kind of like make your own decisions, be in charge of your life. Even for the, you know, quote unquote high functioning among us, that often some, you know, especially today, I'm not feeling like I'm functioning very well at all. But you know, I think therapy has the potential to help autistic people. We now know that there are all of these different things we can do. It's just a question of giving us the access, right? And not forcing us to fit into a little therapy box.
Yeah. And I think this is why it's so important that, you know, before we embark on therapy, that we really do our homework. To be honest, you know, other than the kind of, I need to like vent my rage in a book, it was more about actually what's the takeaway for people, like what are the practical strategies, you know, what do we need to learn before we go to therapy in order that we're able to like self-advocate for ourselves. Because when we're in that relationship, the power imbalance can often feel very much in favour of the therapist. They're like right and healthy, we're wrong and we don't know what we're doing,
and they're in charge as well. They're in charge of the process.
Yeah. And you know, so the more that we learn about what to expect, you know, in terms of advocating for ourselves, but just in making sure that we're getting a good deal in therapy. And that we call out negative behaviours. And I think that's something that often we don't necessarily feel it's okay to do in therapy, to challenge the therapist, because we're perceived as being difficult, or, you know, we're not cooperating in the therapy. But actually, if we're leaving every week after 50 minutes, you know, 70 quid lighter, and we're feeling that actually we've had no benefit from it, there's no point, it's not working.
So final chance, could you plug your book, The Autistic Survival Guide to Therapy?
Yes.
Sat there behind you.
Yes.
How can people buy this book and support you?
You can, it's worldwide. All good bookshops. It's available on.
What about the bad ones?
There may be some bad ones. I'm not here to judge any books. It's on Audible. It's an eBook. If you go to the JKP website, I know you put in a code.
We have a discount code. I can't remember what it is.
Will it be here? Will it flash up on the screen?
It might be down here, but it really depends on what platform people are listening or watching this. So, you know, we can gesture wildly. There will be a discount code put in with the links, and I'll try and put as many links as I can in for people to get that. But I really, I just wanted to reiterate how much I loved the book and how much it resonated with me in a way that I don't always get from books about autism. I just, you know, some of them work, some of them don't for me, and I thought this one was really fantastic. So well done on completing such a ambitious and important project. It's
just been a labour of love. You know, there's I think I spoke to about, it was over 200 neurodivergent people who've contributed their stories to the book. So it's not just my story. It's like, you know, there's like dozens of neurodivergent therapists that have given their advice, and professionals. But it, you know, the big takeaway, I think, is that, you know, you're not alone. It shouldn't be like this. I shouldn't have to write a book on it. We shouldn't be going and having these awful experiences where we're misdiagnosed and misunderstood and traumatised. But hopefully there's something in there that will help. So,
yeah, well, I mean, you know, a book is just a wonderful way of making change and making ripples, and hopefully, you know, getting in front of the right people, and what do they call it? Winning hearts and minds and that sort of thing.
I like that.
Well, thank you so much for being such an interesting and amazing guest. Despite our both of our brains not being on top form at the moment, we got through it.
I need to lie down now. I know.
I'm like, I need a cup of coffee and then I lie down or something. I'm not sure what I need, actually. But it was wonderful to talk to you, and I mean, I could talk about the brain for ages. Maybe that should be another one, because I just think it's so interesting, and it's sort of so validating. It's like, it's not just it's not all in our minds. It's literally in our bodies, wired into us. So, thank you so much for sharing your insight and wisdom and experience. And I guess, I don't know, should we rate this out of 10? Was it an awkward conversation today?
It wasn't. No, I like what I don't know. It's not, you're not awkward. I no. It's my perception of self, because my brain is just like, But again, it's that top down, bottom up thing. Somebody asks you a question and you've just got like a million possible answers, and you're trying to convey that in a nice like bite-sized like point. That's really hard when you're neurodivergent, because we've got like the detail, and it's like, how do I push this out of my mouth now?
Okay, that was a little awkward.
I'm going now. Thanks.
Right. Well, wonderful to talk to you, and hope that oh god, I'm so we've been talking for an hour now. We've both lost all brain capacity. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed. Christ. I hope you enjoyed the episode. End, cut, and thank you for watching and listening.
Bye.